Get ready before life happens. The podcast helping you navigate life's what ifs.
Being named an executor is often seen as an honor until you discover how complicated, emotional it can be. Today, we unpack what it really takes to settle an estate with confidence and clarity. Welcome to Get Ready Before Life Happens. I'm pleased to be joined today by Julie Rains. Julie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah,
Glad to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you back. And, so tell us a little bit about your origin story and how did it lead you to focusing on this conversation about being an executor?
So, my background is in finance. I know that's kind of how we met through the financial media world. And then a couple of years ago, a few years ago, my dad named me as executor for his estate, and then he died. He was almost 96 when he died. And so I felt like I had a pretty good handle on what needed to be done. He just had a few accounts. He had a house that was his biggest asset. I'm very detail oriented. I read the fine print of the insurance policies. I'm that kind of person. So I thought this wouldn't be that big of a deal. And even when I was just getting started, work with a hospital, after when he died, I was there when he died, and then work with a funeral home and planning a service and got the death certificate, started the process of getting his life insurance and then his IRAs, and everything seemed to be pretty steady. I had access to he had a computer and he had access to his bank accounts just to view those things. And one thing that he was older, he was very mentally sharp, but older and became frail and before he died. But he always told us about, the house. He told me about everything about the house. And one thing he emphasized, he was going to pay the property taxes. So every year he would pay the property taxes. So we would make sure, we didn't have that burden for that. And one of the other big things he talked about was the insurance and the house insurance. He said it was on auto pay. And so he wanted to make sure, because he was very important, I thought you might appreciate this, that he wanted to make sure insurance was kept in place and ready to go. So I was like, okay, good. So I was doing, getting things ready, feel like I had things under control. And I went to check his bank account just to because I needed that information to apply for a probate. And I noticed his account was zero. And so I thought, well, what happened here? And so I called the bank and they said, well, we froze the account. And I'm like, what? And I hadn't, in hindsight, I probably learned a lot of things. I didn't know that they would freeze the account. And I wasn't going to spend money out of the account, but I was counting on that insurance being paid as he had promised. And then the house, like I said, is the biggest asset, so the biggest risk there. So that turns out, and you might know this, having worked in an estate, that when the death certificate was filed with the court notified it. My understanding is the court notified the Social Security, and the Social Security notified the bank or called back his direct deposit from the bank. So the bank immediately froze the account. So it's like, okay, so now I'm like, okay, this is the biggest asset, and I'm into risk management, at least as much as I knew how to manage. I thought I need to make sure I keep this insurance in place. There was a reason he told me about that. So, but then I was like, well, what are my rights as an executor? I don't necessarily own the property yet, or do I? The attorney that prepared the will was a family member, and I asked some questions of that, but he wasn't able to answer some of that. He doesn't really practice that law, and that's not necessarily an attorney question. But so I thought about it. I thought, well, let me call the state insurance commissioner's office. They can tell me what my rights are. So I called them, and they told me that I could call and that I could keep the insurance in place, that as long as I knew, paid the bill, paid the premium, and then paid knew when the renewal, up to the time that it was renewed. So I searched through his office and found his statements. So I knew when the bill was due, and I knew when the policy was renewed, and I was good, felt like I was good. Called the company. And then at this point, I also don't have any estate funds, because this is at the very beginning. So there's no money to pay. I mean, I had money myself. So I went ahead and put that on my credit card. So now I'm paying money for the estate, or for the house, already, like just a few days in. So this was like, it was just a surprise. I didn't know to expect that. I didn't quite realize, and this is maybe more obvious to a lot of people once you've done one, I didn't realize there's a waiting period between when, like, you're named in the will as executor, but I didn't know that the court had to appoint you to that role. So so there's a time frame there that you don't have access to money anyway. So all this was a surprise to me. And it wasn't the first surprise. And I wanted to, that has really motivated me because I'm interested in finance and I'm interested in legacy and knew how much my dad, were fairly close and wanted him to pass on his legacy. So I wanted to honor his legacy. And that experience and that surprises, even as prepared as he was and as I was, a simple surprise just a few days in. I just wanted to help other people not have those surprises, or if they do have the surprises, to know how to deal with it. So that's a long, long drawn out story there, but
well, I've really been enjoying you covering it in your Substack, and for people watching and listening, there'll be a link in the show notes to Julie's Substack, and we'll give you a chance to shout it out later on in the show. But you've really done a great job of sharing your journey and your insights. I just want to emphasize a couple of things you mentioned is having cash to settle an estate is you also have to be careful with the bank account. I think as you've shared in your newsletter, is that bank accounts, and I think you alluded to it in your answer there, is that bank accounts can get frozen. So you don't necessarily have access to that cash. So that's something to think about when you're planning your estate, is making sure your executor is going to have access to some cash to settle the estate. And sometimes an estate can be very expensive to settle. I think the other thing you point out is that the court has to appoint you as an executor. Do you know if that's true in every state?
I'm assuming that every state is different. And I'm assuming that you do have to be appointed. That's a good question. And I'm not quite as familiar with trust, but trust, there's not so much that financial no man's land. But as far as an executor, which was applies to a will, I'm thinking they typically do have to be. There's typically a waiting period, but it could differ. Mine ended up, and you probably asked me more about this, but when I went to make the application, I handed in, and I thought the deputy clerk said it'd be processed with 4 to 6 days. And then I talked first attorney that I talked to interviewed them. They were like, no, it's 4 to 6 weeks. And mine ended up being processed fairly quickly. So I had my letters within a few weeks, but that is a huge gap there. And there's different ways to fill the gap. And one of those is my dad had life insurance and they processed that fairly quickly. And I had also, just because of all the market up and downs just in the past, my lifetime, I made sure I had cash just available. So I was fortunate that I had cash on my own to spend. But it is important, yeah, because that's one thing, you want to protect the estate.
Yeah, and that's something, because you and I met, as I'm a life insurance subject matter expert. We write about that. And it's something, because that's actually something people who've been following me for a while know, that I'm really not a permanent life insurance person. But that's a compelling argument to keep a small permanent life insurance policy in force, so you do have that liquidity, because as soon as you get that death certificate, you can file it. And generally, life insurance companies, unless there's something unusual about a death, they pay that claim fairly quickly. So that is ready cash that you can use to settle your estate.
Right.
So.
Yeah. And I always wondered why he kept that. And then I got that pretty quickly.
And you're making me rethink advice I've been giving for decades about that, because that is something to consider, is that source of ready cash, whether it's a fund that you put aside for your kids or something, but your kids have to be able to access it. So, naming your executor, I think if your executor is a co-account holder, do you know if they have access to it? Or does it get frozen sometimes?
Yeah. So one of the things I'll say is sometimes banks do things they're not, and I'm not I probably will bash some banks here, so forgive me ahead of time because there's some that do really well. But sometimes banks might freeze something where they should or shouldn't. You know, they also play by their own rules. That's kind of another aside. But to your point, sometimes what some people do is they have a joint account owner, and that person, has that cash available. Um, I had talking to someone I knew that had that the executor was a POA and then became the executor, and they had a joint account. But apparently, the type of joint account they had was something that was shut down after the death. So it depends on the type of joint account that you have. And it's not necessarily, that's also kind of a complicated way. It's an easy way to have money access, but it's not necessarily the proper planning way, in my understanding. Because then maybe you have one child that has the joint account and there's three children. Well, technically that child owns that account after your death. And your intention may have been to give the money to all three children, for example. So that's kind of a little bit of something that's expeditious, but it may not be the perfect planning tool, if that makes sense.
Oh, do you have any recommendations on that planning tool?
Oh, that's a good question. That is an excellent question, Tony. I don't know if I do consult your lawyer, but I think maybe to be aware of that's the issue. And actually, I had my husband's they have a similar issue, and the lawyer has suggested that they split the account, at some point down the road. So, but you've got to trust that person. Of course, if somebody's your POA and you're executor, you should trust them. But I think the life insurance is a great option. And some people, again, the trust is an option because there's not that financial no man's land that you're operating without cash.
Yeah. And for everybody watching and listening, none of this is legal advice. This is just personal observations and experience. So, definitely consult the laws in your own state, check with your attorney. Be careful when you do online research on these areas to make sure that you're getting advice from somebody who's credible and qualified. There are a lot of attorneys who have blogs and podcasts and things like that. So, I don't have any recommendations offhand. I'll try to get something in the show notes. But there are a lot of estate planning attorneys who do talk about these things online. And so they're credible because this is what they do. So I'd recommend to people who aren't sure is to seek out those sources rather than just the first YouTube video that pops up that covers this.
Yeah. And I'll say that just to add on to that is the situations are so different. Everybody's situation, the state laws are so different. Even if you have a really credible estate lawyer, you may think a situation applies to you and it may not. So, but the important thing I think is you need cash and you need to figure out how to get the cash. So I think that's
well, there is a mattress technique is, you just keep cash under your mattress and then your kids can access that if something happens to you.
People that have done that too, Tony. Thank you for saying that because I know somebody else that actually the person went out and got all her money in a bank account and put it and converted it to cash before she died. And it was there available for the family. So yeah, there's a lot of, I'm not saying I recommend that, but that is something that has happened.
Yeah. And, there are techniques where, depending, now an issue that comes up sometimes is parents aren't comfortable with how the kids may manage your money. But if you are comfortable with your kids managing money is you can always make a gift to them is another technique to get a little money out of your estate, as well as to have the kids have some money put aside. But that gets into family dynamics. And everything. So, to get back to your journey, because I think this is what's been so cool is that it's your own personal journey, is what made you decide to start writing about it and sharing about it? Because, before this, you were really concentrating on the principles of your other book, Save, Invest, Protect. And now you're talking about being an executor. I mean, it's awesome. But what inspired you to make that change and go, hey, I want to share this?
So I think the general answer, I was just fascinated by the subject. And when I started writing about it, I was actually I was in an online writing community. That was when I published my first book. That was where I developed that first book. And when my dad died, I was still in this community. And so that was what was happening in my life. And so I started documenting and writing about it. And then when things got a little bit crazy, it was like, oh, this might be interesting. This might be helpful. Um, I think one of my initial motivations was I thought that I could somehow, and I'm not giving this up necessarily, impact some sort of legislation. Um, there's a lot of rules that the executors have to follow, but there's not that many that protect the executors, in my humble opinion. For example, with the banks. Um, so when I guess you do a stock trade, it should be settled, or the brokerage firm, you had to be settled within a certain number of days. There's like a fair credit recording act that if you have a credit card, they're not going to there's fraudulent protections there if somebody uses your credit card. So there's a lot of laws to protect consumers, but there seem to be none that would protect executors. Like if you filed a claim for an IRA, you would think, well, they should have it finished within, as long as you have all the information. And they should tell you exactly what you should do, but they don't necessarily. But if you do, they should tell you what you should do, and they should be able to process it within. I know it doesn't matter to me whether it was be 2 weeks or a month or whatever, but there should be a time frame, and there's not really, as far as I know, there's not any sort of time frames there. So that was what I first would have loved to have seen. And later, I think as I got into it, I realized that that might be kind of a big project, a long one. And I thought, well, the more that I can empower and educate executors on the process, that would help. That would help solve some of these problems. And part of that is just choosing um, the right brokerage firm, the right bank. There's some that are easier to work with than others. So but that was really, and I just enjoy the work, and I really got into just talking with people and thinking about inheritances and seeing family dynamics, as you mentioned, is seeing how an inheritance can be important in somebody's life, and it could even be life changing. But if you don't have that financial savvy going into it, or at least aware that you don't have financial savvy, you're going to blow your inheritance. And that a better path would be more that legacy, and not is legacy is like the broader thing you want to pass along, and then money is a component of that. And the more that you can teach your children, whoever you're going to be passing along money to, the more you can teach them now, today, and to be financially responsible, the better. So I think I see that as a little bit more of a continuum. So it kind of bridges my other work in finance to legacy work as well, to the executor work. So I hope that
Yeah.
answers your question.
Yeah, well, I love that. And I think that brings up something that's super important is families need to have what I call a family transition meeting, for lack of a better word, where the, the aging parents need to talk to their adult kids, at least generally. They don't have to get into the specifics of the accounts, because I know a lot of people don't like talking about that, and that's
Mhm.
okay. I don't know if you necessarily need to talk about account balances, but you can talk about the account types. I mean, is that something you're recommending to people, is to start having family meetings to talk about these issues?
I think it's important, yes, that they have some understanding of what's available and the types of accounts, because they might not have access to what your account information is. Um, and one thing I've been thinking about is a little bit. It, it's nice if everybody would be in the same room, that everybody's telling is here's the same story, if that makes sense. For example, my dad made sure when he had the will, he made sure he gave it to each of us, so we all knew, you know, what he wanted, and same thing with his healthcare power of attorney. We knew we were on the same page. So I think having those conversations, they may look different for each family. Um, I know somebody that she said her dad had remarried, and had been generous with the family when they, throughout his lifetime. Still, hopefully, he will be around longer. But he married a younger woman, um, and brought the whole family together and said, "Listen, my estate is going to go to my second wife," and so everybody knew, and so it wasn't going to be a surprise later. So I think I think those kind of conversations, there's a lot of different ways the conversation could go, but I think some of those conversations, everybody's on the same, has the same understanding, um, is helpful.
Yeah, I think that's important, especially, when you talk about like, marriages with second or even third spouses and kids
Mhm,
from each marriage is family dynamics can get pretty tricky,
mhm,
but
mhm.
it is someone's money and they can choose to do what they
Right.
wish with it. And as an heir, you may think they should be doing one thing, but
Mhm.
it's really up to them. Uh, whether or not you like the choice or not.
And I think it was nice. I think they were all happy with the choice, and I think that was happy. I think that I could see how I had just read this book called Robin Probate, where the husband told the kids, his step kids, his kids. It was a second marriage. Told his wife one thing, and then the kids, who was children from a different marriage, told them something else. So there was this constant clashing over the estate because he gave them mixed stories. Um, but yes, I think, yeah, and you think, and I think since we just, even as executor, you have this idea of what's logical and what should happen, and if something doesn't happen the way you think, well, you've been wronged or it's unfair or whatever, and maybe it is, but um, the more you know that up front, I think the better, and the better that the family relationships can continue.
And I think that's something important is so many families have strained relationships because
Mm-hmm.
of estate settlement. Is
Mm-hmm.
everybody thinks, oh, we're going to get along. We've been, you know, had a good
Uh-huh.
relationship, and then somebody passes away, and ill feelings are created, and it's just it's a shame. It's reality, but
Mm-hmm.
it is a shame. Is so one of the things you talk about is the difference between heirs and beneficiaries. What
Okay.
is the difference between heirs and beneficiaries?
Okay. So I have written about this, and I've just got an update. When I was looking at your question, I have realized that I didn't have the right information. Sort of did, sort of didn't. And you might know this, Tony, better than I do, but so an heir is like designated by the state. There's like a state law dictates who the heirs are. Not, but it defines who the heirs are. Not necessarily who's going to get the money, but who the heirs are. If that makes sense. Like
Hmm.
you typically as a spouse, and then it's children. And then maybe there's grandchildren and parents and everything. And beneficiaries are are people that if they can't honor the beloved is how I refer to it often in Substack, the person that's planning, they designate beneficiaries. Who they designate are the best beneficiaries. Sometimes the heirs and the beneficiaries are going to be the same people, if that makes sense. Um, but beneficiaries, we're thinking about IRAs and life insurance policies, like we talked before. Um, you can have like a brokerage account that you put a transfer on death title with it, and you can name beneficiaries for that. And then the trust had beneficiaries. And I saw something that said wills had beneficiaries. And I was like, what? I thought those wills were heirs. Um, so, and beneficiary, and that's not a perfect distinction. I was trying to do some research on that. There's other distinctions that they call a will, but a general term people often refer to if they're in a will, if somebody's written a will and has a valid will, then the people that are receiving assets are beneficiaries. If for some reason someone dies without a will and hasn't made other designations, then the state law comes into play. They died in intestate is what they call it, and the state law comes into play, and the state law then designates who's going to get the assets, and then that kind of draws on the heirs. So in my case, my mother had died, and my father, we had the three kids, and so he did have a will, and so we were for everything that he had, it was split three ways, so we're all the beneficiaries. Um, Technically we were the heirs, but that wasn't the law that applied. So heirs is, the law goes, how you divide the assets, how you transfer the assets depends on whether you've made a designation before. And if you haven't made a designation, then it goes to the state law, and the state law has a hierarchy. That's the way I remember the hierarchy of heirs. I don't know if that makes sense, but occasionally state law will override a will. Like if you don't designate, like if you have a child that you don't want to include in your will. If you forget to say, oh, I've disowned this person or I'm disclaiming this person, they're not going to get any money, then the state law kind of takes over and says, oh, you didn't say anything about this other child, so we're just going to assume that you meant to include them and you didn't. So state law kind of overrides that. So that's a little messy way of explaining that, but state law it dictates who the heirs are, and you dictate who your beneficiaries are. And if you don't dictate it, then it kind of goes by the state law. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great explanation, and I think the takeaway really is an heir is, who's legally possibly entitled, is maybe your issue, or whatever legal term you want to use is for people to think about your kids, spouses, things like that. And the beneficiary is the person that you actually name and formally named to receive assets. And so it can be all your heirs, it can be a couple of years. And I think it goes back to the situation you described, is where somebody said, I'm not going to leave money to all my heirs. I'm going to leave money just to one of my heirs.
Right.
And so I think that's important. And I think the other thing that you say that is super important that I help people take away, if you don't have an estate plan, the state has an estate plan for you that will probably not be in line with your wishes. So it is worth the time to have a will set up, to have a trust set up by somebody who's qualified to do so. And for people in other countries is, there are different versions of this in every country. So seek out your country's laws, and find out, what works in your country. We're definitely not giving you advice for different countries. It's enough for us to, talk about in the US, because as Julie's pointing out, there's 50 states, so that's 50 different sets of laws, plus you have the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, so that's a lot to manage right there. And everywhere's got their own thing. So it's important to find out how this works with where you live. And that brings up another very valid point, is what is your legal state of residence, and whose law, which state's laws are going to apply to a specific estate, because they're not going to be the laws where you live as an executor. They're going to be the laws of the person who passed away and their residence. So yeah, there's a lot of moving parts to this. So
yes.
So appreciate you sharing the story. So, before we start to close, one of the things you and I talked about this, you've written about this, is you've gotten some surprises, some unpleasant surprises in dealing with financial institutions. What were some of the realities that really surprised you in dealing with financial institutions?
There's some pleasant ones and unpleasant ones. So I think I'll go with the negative first, I guess. But I was surprised that I wasn't always given the information that I needed. I would ask for my choices. One person asked what my choices were. I was trying to claim an IRA, and they wouldn't really give me the choices. And I wanted to take an RMD because I was concerned about the RMD. In hindsight, I realized there was some law changes during the time that my dad died with the RMDs and how they should be taken that I wasn't quite aware of. But anyway, I wanted to take the RMD. They kind of hedged on that. And at some point, I called back, said, well, how, they would say, okay, we'll move forward with this. And then they never did move forward with it. And I called back and they were like, well, I'm kind of new here. And the guys in the office said that wasn't a good idea. We've never done it this way. What? And I actually had to escalate that one. The pleasant surprise with that, the end of that was I went on LinkedIn and found the head of, I guess, the wealth management for this particular company, and joined premium and just message him and say, hey, I'm having some problems, because it had been a few months. And within like an hour or two, I got a response. And he put me on a resolutions team. And within a few days, we had things straightened out. And funnily, they did ask me, they said, well, and they explained your options. I was like, they didn't explain the options. I kept asking for my options and they wouldn't explain it. So, and that happened. And I think a lot of times people they would lose documents. The dashboard that, typically in most of my financial dashboards in my brokerage firm, my bank, if you have you can communicate with encrypted messages and private messages, you can upload files, that kind of thing. The couple of companies, you can have these dashboards, but the information would disappear immediately. So I would submit something, but I could never go back and check and make sure, oh, it is submitted there. Or they would say, oh, it wasn't submitted. And I thought, I think I did that, but I couldn't check on it. So the systems were clunky. And then people would make mistakes. I would think they said, we have to fill out this form for you. And they would fill out the form. And, I've got a million things going on trying to deal with the estate. And they would make a mistake. So I didn't, so I learned to check things. So that was really unpleasantly surprised at the number of mistakes that people made. But there were some bright spots, and some, like the life insurance did settle very quickly with that financial institution. And some people did their jobs very efficiently and things flowed through, as they said. But I was surprised at times when there was a glitch. It just threw things into chaos, it seemed like.
Yeah, and that was my own experience is doing life insurance analysis, because my job was dependent upon receiving information from insurance companies. Some insurance companies were very good at sending, the information I requested
Mm-hmm.
fully, completely, in a timely
Mm-hmm.
fashion, and other insurance companies would send bits and pieces of it, or, I'd have to follow up multiple times. And so I think, that's a really important thing for people to take away here is that you have to stay on top of these financial institutions. Some are going to be better than
Mm-hmm.
others. You're dealing with people. And now you're dealing with
Mm-hmm.
AI, and AI, while it has its positives, it also has its negatives. So you have to make sure you're tracking these things and following up. And I think, in the smell test, if something doesn't seem like it's quite right, or you don't feel like you're getting the information, then follow up, as you did with in a different
Mm-hmm.
way. I think the other thing though, too, is now that you do have AI, some like ChatGPT, is you can ask ChatGPT some of the questions about what your options should be. And while it won't always be 100% accurate, it will give you some new things to think about. And I think that's super important. So I'm glad you bring that up because, even within a financial institution, you might reach somebody who's not going to be quite as experienced as somebody else. If somebody's new, unfortunately, they may not do the job somebody else can do.
Mm-hmm. I've definitely experienced that.
So, is there any, single piece of advice you'd give to someone who might be named an executor for them to think about besides like take a deep breath?
Besides what?
Besides take a deep breath?
So, I mean, I think to me, what I'd advise was to learn as much about, if you can, about estate work and finances. The more you know about finances, whether you're still in a estate or not, I think the better off you'll be, just in general, but also as an executor. And I was never, I definitely got frustrated with the people I had to work with, but I never really felt intimidated. And I can imagine being very intimidated if I didn't have a finance background and I hadn't worked in banking years ago, but I hadn't. So, but the more you know in general, I think the better. Just the financial literacy as a base, and then more about estate settlement through books.
Yeah.
And hopefully, I'll have a book coming out. I'm trying to work on a fiction book about my story. So, the more you can know, the better.
Yeah, I think that's really valuable advice is, financial literacy can help you in a lot of ways, but knowledge
Mm-hmm.
always gives you confidence.
Mm-hmm.
In my book, there's that saying, knowledge is power. And, that's a very accurate statement. So, Julie, to close out, I have what's called the Get Ready Hot Take Trio. These are 3 quick questions I'm asking all my guests. The first one is, what's one myth about being an executor you wish everyone would let go?
So the one I wish people would let go of when I was discussing it was um, talking with friends is that I wasn't the crazy one. I think you think that the executors going, then they're going through grief, they're learning a lot of new things, but so many things that went wrong were not my fault. Um, and so I think people will let go that, you're not operating, things are not, there's been an assumption that things aren't going well for me or an executor because the executor doesn't know what they're doing. While that might be true some of the times, I think very often it's not going well because the financial institutions or some of the people that they're dealing with just aren't doing their job. And so you're having to do two jobs. You have to do the executor job, then you're also having to really monitor other people's jobs as well.
Definitely, definitely. Well, and that is, I guess, part of being an executor. And then, as you said, is you have your own grief that you're trying to process at the same time as you're doing that. And, if you're a parent, you got your kids running around and, you have everything else going on at the same time. So it's, I would say, just put aside a little bit of time each week to do your executor job and to see it through. So that's great advice. So Julie, let's get out the time machine right now. So if you could go back in time to before you were an executor, what's one tip you would give yourself?
So, can I be very specific? This is a kind of
Oh,
so
yeah.
one of the things that happened to us is my dad had decided in his mid 90s, I guess, that he wasn't going to drive anymore. So we gave the car to my sister, which was fun. But he never found the title. And so the title wasn't transferred over. And so he still had the title, still was in his name, still was paying insurance. And that would have been a pretty simple fix to change the title over and change all that. Simple if you found the title. And, you know, a day's worth. Well, we didn't find the title. I didn't know anything about this. I just knew that I thought everything was done. I didn't think to ask about a title. Anyway, after he died, um, I did find a title, but I couldn't transfer it immediately. I had to wait to get letters testamentary and then wait for the notice to creditors period to pass. So that's like a 4 month period that I couldn't actually make that transfer. And then I was concerned, again, risk management, concerned about liability. I kept the liability in place, but I was still concerned. I didn't have time necessarily to research liability law and how that would happen if they happen to have an accident and all that. But that was a concern for me, and that was some stress that added on to this process is that I couldn't act. I could see the risk, but I can only do a certain amount to mitigate it. So just sometimes there's certain things that you can take care of before somebody dies that are really simple. They get very complicated afterwards if you wait. So that would be
Yeah,
too, something small. Take care of it.
I'm just making a note on that because I think that's really important is, this is a gift you can leave to your heirs is to have your estate organized and to take care of
Mhm.
what can be taken care of before you pass away, because it's much easier to do that. Um, so that's awesome advice. Take care of your business. It's a great gift you
Mhm.
can leave for
Mhm.
your kids
Mhm. Mhm.
and your loved ones. So, Julie, what's your number one tip to change the way we think about money and being an executor?
So what I would want you to think about like adult responsibilities. And I say this, and I think about there's things that I've learned even as a later in life adult, like learn how to deal with contractors, deal with plumbers. There was some issues. Um, Learn about estates. There's so much that we can learn that can help us in life. Learn about planning a funeral, learn about dealing with a funeral home. It could be talking with your kids more about the money, things that we kind of think we may or may not gravitate as to as adults, or maybe. But the more adulting skills you can do, the more financial skills I think you can do, the better off you'll be, and the better off I think your family will be.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, and I think that's, it's a little bit beyond financial literacy. Is I think financial literacy sort of caps what people should know is that we need to go beyond, like you said, is learn about legacy, think about our family dynamics, advanced directives, all those things, understand how all those things work, is because that's another area where I've seen a lot of family friction is when somebody needs care and the advanced directive is not in line with what members of the family think that somebody would want. So, there's a lot of factors there that you bring up. So that's awesome. So, Julie, where can people learn more about you, your work, and subscribe to your newsletter?
So I'm going to send you to juliereigns.com because from there you can subscribe to the newsletter, the Substack. I can't remember the whole, it's Julie Reigns at Substack or Julie Reigns Substack. And that's the Save, Invest, Protect, Preserve. And that's what I'm calling that. So, but juliereigns.com, and also tells about my book and some other websites and more about me. So I would send them there. Thank you for asking.
Yeah, fantastic. And for everybody watching and listening, if you have access to the show notes, all those links will be in the show notes. So you can go there to get the links. So, Julie, thanks for coming back on the podcast and sharing insights. Appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and thank you everyone as always for tuning into this episode of Get Ready Before Life Happens. If you like this episode, please be sure to share and subscribe. You can also go to my website at tonystewart.com to join the Get Ready movement. And if you want to support this podcast, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/Tony Stewart. Because when life happens, the way you think about money matters.